Hi, welcome to the second of a three-part series on building applications with SAP River. My name is Rafi Brill. I'm the product manager for SAP River. Hopefully you've watched the first installment and the first demo, and you know that we're gradually building an application using SAP River, and it's based around an airline called River Airlines, and we're building a very basic application that allows you to create flights and then book passengers on flights. And this is the data model for the application. In the first step of the demo, we focused on data definition. So we created the initial project, shared and activated it to the repository. We added the data model, or the set of entities that are part of the application, and we created some initial test data so that we can test our app. In this second step, we're going to be focusing on business logic. We're going to be showing you how to add custom actions to your River project. We're going to be showing you how to add some permissions logic, how to interoperate or how to integrate SAP River with external artifacts such as tables and JavaScript or SQL script procedures. And we'll be running custom actions, including debugging those actions as well. So let's go back to the HANA Studio, SAP HANA Development Perspective. And you recall this is where we left off the first set of the demo. So we had our data definition, which is composed of flights, seats, passengers, and cities, and some types. And we generated some test data for cities and for flights. So what we'd like to do now is add some business logic. And there is some code which I copied into my clipboard, and I will now paste this code into the HANA Studio. So let's have a look at what I've added. So if we bring up the outline, you can see that I've added some actions: get free seats, open for seating, and so forth. There are some save actions here and some global actions at the application level, so they're not part of a specific entity. Now what's interesting is that even though I added the new actions at the bottom of my application, in fact, you can see here, for example, entity flight appears again with some actions for flight. It in fact appears within the outline as part of the initial definition. So I could have, of course, pasted these actions within the definition of flight up here, but I don't have to do that. I can redefine the entity called flight down below, again, add some actions for flight, and the compiler is clever enough to combine this into a single coherent specification for flight. And in fact, in future, it will be possible to divide this into multiple physical files. So potentially different people could code different aspects of the application in different files, and then all will be compiled into a single coherent specification. If we have a look at the code I've added, so I've added some access control logic. So some of these keywords indicate to the compiler that these actions should be accessible or callable from outside the bounds of the application. I've defined a role called dispatcher, and this role is referenced in the action called open for seating. So this indicates to the compiler that only a user with the role of dispatcher can call this action. If we look at some of the code that I've written here, one interesting aspect is that this particular action calls an external table within HANA. It accesses data from an external table. You can see here SAP HANA catalog SAP seats.cplan. Now this is in fact a table that exists in HANA. If I change this to 1, so the parser is in fact resolving this particular reference during parsing and checking whether it's a valid reference and indicating to me that it's not. And if I change this back to 1, then now all is good, and I can be sure that this is in fact a valid table within HANA. But let's assume that I don't know which table I'm looking for. So let's comment that out. And let's say let places equal, and you can see that I get some code completion options, so I can choose from a variety of entities which exist in my program. But we, as we know, would like something which is external to River. So let's start from. And now what I can do is I can invoke this search feature. And I get this little search tool up here. And I happen to know that I'm looking for a table called seat plan. So I hit search. And I get as a response a set of tables which have the word seat plan or something like seat plan in their metadata for the table name or the column name. And in fact, seat plan is the first option that I get, which is nice. And when I click on that, I get a nice preview of my table. You can see this is essentially the plan from my plane. It shows me which rows are available, and for each row which seats there are, what is the letter for that seat, and whether it's an X row or not. So this is the table I use to build or to provision my set of seats for a flight. So when I click OK, you can see that the tool will actually inject this particular table name into my code so that I can complete my query. But in this case, we're happy with our initial logic, so let's go back to the logic that we had previously. So that's one thing I wanted to show you. Another thing I'd like to show you is how I would leverage existing objects within HANA. In this case, I'm using the HTTP request procedure within HANA, but I'm calling it from within River in what seems to be a very native and convenient way. So I'm creating a variable, calling the procedure, and defining the parameters for that procedure. So it's a very elegant, a very simple way to interface your River code with existing stored procedures in JavaScript, or in this case, I could even call a SQL script procedure. The third thing I'd like to show you is how I could use JavaScript inline. So in this case, there's a bit of code which I'm using to pass the JSON response. We don't yet have that particular logic written or available in River. So I can break out from River into JavaScript. Anything that's between these curly brackets is considered by the compiler to be JavaScript. And you can see that again, even though there's a mixture of River and JavaScript, there's a very simple and convenient interface between the two. So I define this variable outside the bounds of the JavaScript code, and then I use the variable within it. So it's a very simple way to interface the two. So that was just a quick view of the code. What we need to do now is to reactivate our application. So of course it needs to be saved as well. And River is now compiling or activating our River code. Okay, again we have this gold descriptor on the icon, so our compilation is successful. What I'd like to do now is to open a flight for seating. So we'll click on flight. So I've now refreshed the data preview tool for flight. And when I click on a specific flight, you can see that this new button here has been added. And this button allows me to run the actions which I've just added in my program. So it understands what actions are relevant to the entity called flight. So let's run an action called open for seating. This is an action which essentially will initialize the flight, change the status to open, and provision a set of seats for that flight. It's an action that takes simply an instance of a flight as an incoming parameter. So let's click run. And you can see that the action is run successfully. What is returned here, in fact, is the number of seats which have been provisioned on that flight, purely for informational purposes. But if we now go to the seat entity and click on data preview, you will see that I now have 42 rows in this table, all pointing at this same flight, indicating which row each seat belongs to, what is the type, what is the seat letter, is it an exit row, and of course the status of these seats is all free. because we've not yet assigned seats to any passengers on our flight. So let's go back to the flight entity. And now what I'd like to do is create a booking for a passenger on this flight. But before I want to do that, I'd like to set a breakpoint. So let's go to the action book passenger. And let's set a breakpoint on the first row of this action. And now let's pick this same flight that we opened, so the status now is true. And let's run book passenger. And let's give it a name, an email address. I happen to like aisle seats, so let's pick aisle, and there's a nice algorithm behind the scenes here that tries to allocate the most appropriate seat for the passenger based on their preferences. And let's click run in debugger. So now the action is running, and in fact it is stopped on this particular row, and we can see that it's let FL equal flight num. And up here in the debug perspective, I can actually introspect some of my variables. So as I step through the lines of the code, you can see that, for example, flight is now set to 231. R, which is the row number, has been set to 1. C, which is the seat code, has been set to C. And I'm now saving the passenger, saving the seat status. I'm now calling a procedure to get the weather for this arrival city and returning the result. So you can see that my action is now completed. I've been assigned seat 1C on flight 231, and this call has actually retrieved the weather in Las Vegas, so it's now clear and the temperature is 0 degrees in Las Vegas. So let's go back to our development perspective. So we've now run the action, and just to complete the story, let's have a look at the passenger entity, and we'll do a data preview on that. And you can see that I now have a new row, a new instance in the passenger entity under my name. And if I click on assign seat, you can see that in fact it is associated with seat 1C, which is an aisle seat, and of course the status is now reserved. So we have successfully booked myself on this flight and assigned me a seat. So that completes the second of 3 demos. Just to recap, in this demo we showed you how to add custom actions, we defined some permissions logic, we showed some interoperability with existing tables of views via the search feature, we showed you how to access existing tables in HANA, we used inline JavaScript and we called the JavaScript procedure, and we ran some custom actions, including one in debug mode. So thank you for tuning in, and hopefully you'll have a look at our third video, which completes the story through integration from a UI application calling this backend application. Thank you very much.